Welcome, everyone, to the Yoga Well podcast. My name is Melissa Shah, pronouns are she and they, and I'll be your host for today. I'm coming to you with the background of being a yoga therapist, working with people one on one as well as in small groups. And I also really love mentoring yoga teachers and yoga therapists and supporting them and integrating these really holistic practices and how to really embody them in their life, and really teaching them and myself to just take your time and let these practices really settle in. So that's a little bit about me and what I like to do. I'm here with one of my teachers, Chase Plessart. Chase, do you want to say hi?
Hello. Thanks for being here today, Melissa. It's awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. We're gonna have a really good conversation today. But first, wondering if we can start with some chanting.
Sure.
Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sah Viryam Karvavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu Ma Vitveshavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Okay, let's begin. So today we are talking a little bit about what is the present and also future of yoga therapy, and how do we make sure that as we continue to preserve these practices and integrate them and interpret them in our own ways, that we're also making sure that we're doing it with integrity. And I know that's a bit of a broad word, but one way that Chase and I have been talking about this is really talking about the tension that's often there with integrating yoga therapy into Western healthcare models. And that can mean maybe if you're a yoga therapist or yoga teacher, that could mean that you're teaching in a healthcare facility. But it could also mean that you're supporting people one on one who are just like all of us are existing, or many of us are existing in a Western healthcare models. You might be supporting someone who also has some health conditions where they have their primary care doctor and they have their therapist or they have their specialists, and you're a part of their care team or their support team. And it can be a little challenging to think about how do we make sure that we're really offering the magic of what yoga therapy can be and ensuring that we're not stripping down or diluting the practice in order to make it more palatable for consumption or to sterilize it so that it becomes more valid in some way from a Western healthcare lens. I think this is really tricky and it probably requires more than one podcast, but I know that many of us are probably dealing with that. And I know that I am. And as someone that has in some ways grown up with these practices and also is Indian American, has grown up in the Indian diaspora, I think this kind of tension is something I'm really comfortable or familiar with because we're constantly living in this third culture of assimilating into American culture while trying to maintain my Indian identity. And in the diaspora, it's so different in each family because there's also like financial and social class. There's also what kind of support system do you have? All these things really play a role in, to at least in my experience, what my family was able to keep and pass down versus maybe what they had to put to the side in order to survive. So I'm just sharing that share. I think that there's some parallel here when we're thinking about what does it mean to assimilate into Western culture and what does that actually mean for the future of yoga therapy. So I want to pause there for a second. Chase, any thoughts coming up for you around this in terms of these questions that I'm posing?
Well, I will be talking for the rest of the podcast now because what you just said was so rich, and I have all these comments, so I'm going to come into. I want to say that you're really pointing to a really critical piece that yoga needs to come to terms with if we are going to successfully navigate our integration, if such a thing is even possible, with Western healthcare. What I see happening is people are not, in general, there is low awareness that there are other medical systems besides the dominant allopathic medical system. And anyone in an allopathic model is just operating from the fact that this is how the body is, this is how it functions, this is what it does, and then anything that is brought to it or to them, they try to understand it based on the truths of their own experience and their own education and whatnot. And when we start with yoga, I think we really need to acknowledge that we're starting from an incredibly different point than allopathic medicine. In some regards, allopathic medicine or important fundamental regards. Allopathic medicine has rejected soul or spirit. It is a physical facts are all the facts practice. You need to be able to explain everything from the science as a double blind proof, etc. And from yoga, we are explicitly spiritual beings having human experiences, residing in a human container. So, like, the starting points couldn't be more different. And from an allopathic perspective, well, spirit is a belief and is something that is, we can account for it in these other ways. Doesn't really give us, it doesn't really accept us. There's a block there. Now, I'm not saying you have to believe in God to practice yoga, etc. I'm just saying that yoga's medical system comes out of a Samkhya understanding that all beings have material, physical aspects, includes body, mind, senses, emotions, thoughts. All these things are material, and something more, something beyond that. So there's a question here whether or not it's actually possible to integrate, i.e., create a single category that includes yoga and allopathic perspectives. That's the first thought I have.
So, I mean, there's just so much there, so many layers. And one thing I'm hearing from what you're, maybe a question that you didn't ask, but maybe I'm hearing is, can there maybe be a distinction from having to fold our systems into Western healthcare versus maybe honoring it as its own system in its own right, and maybe being complementary to allopathic medicine, or maybe even running parallel to it, which, I mean, other disciplines have done in some ways, right? We see acupuncture. Now, I know that there's a whole conversation about acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine that, is not necessarily my expertise, but I know that there's some conversations on how that maybe has been adapted and diluted in some ways. But, when I used to work at an integrative healthcare facility, the acupuncturist was always talking about qi and meridians, and no one ever told him, like, you can't say that and that doesn't make sense. And because it's been accepted now as this is a different kind of system that we're also utilizing to complement what we already know. And I think yoga therapy in some ways is, because it's still an emerging, quote unquote industry, or a profession,
Field.
some of these questions are now coming, right? Yeah, field. There you go, field. And some of those questions are still coming. And one thing I kind of heard you pointing to as well was, in the Sankhya model of which, the foundation of, really of yoga is, what's the root of that model is this duality of Purusha and Prakriti, of like spirit and our material body. And like you said, well, we're actually spirit first, having this like physical experience. And it sounds like, where that might not always quite fit into a Western model is because maybe there's a potential fear, of consciousness, or a fear of something spiritual that is so subtle that no one can touch it, no one can hold it, you can't quantify it. And I'm wondering, like, what you think about that. Like, do you think that fear of the immaterial, or something, yeah, something that might be bigger than just, our brains and our nervous systems or our muscles and bones, that fear might be driving a lot of this urge to strip away some of these parts of yoga or yoga therapy in order to make them more palatable?
Very interesting question. I want to steer it a little bit away from trying to interpret what's happening on the other side, right?
Also
So
fair. Thank you for that.
So, I don't want to say, well, they're afraid of, or they did it because I'm not there. I don't know. I think the important part is to know what matters to us and to be able to stand in what is fundamental to us and to be able to articulate that. So, what is the implication of we are spirit foundation operating in materiality? The implication of that is prana, as the expression of spirit in materiality, is the primary thing that we're working with. So, very much like the acupuncturists are working with qi, and they have channels and meridians and those things, we as yoga practitioners and in the therapeutic application of yoga, we are thinking about prana's movement in the system. And we have clear articulations about what influences prana. And prana in different locations of the body are sensitive to different techniques. So we have a whole science of how we're using attention and breathing and sound as a way of influencing the movement of prana in the body and whatnot. And that is fundamental to who we are. And we need to own that and keep that. And it may or may not be understandable from a system that thinks about nervous system or thinks about anything but prana, right? You can't actually capture prana in an allopathic instrument of any kind. So they're left with, well, I don't know what to say or do. And the problem that we face is that if we're going to be integrated within, say, a hospital or say within, a medical center, that we need to have the autonomy to work in ways that honor our perspective. And if the danger is that people look at yoga from the outside, from an allopathic method, they see physical movements, they see breathing, they see body positions, etc., and they think that the allopathic understandings of anatomy and physiology can capture what it is that we're doing. And then they want to subsume yoga within their model. And then that's like taking a three-dimensional object and smushing it flat. So it's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing.
When you're mentioning, thank you for that. I think it's really, really clear. I think one thing that's getting clear for me too is like there's all sorts of camps or factions, right? Of people's beliefs that there are, maybe people who are like, that's okay. We need to do the research. Let's maybe like smush this down to make it something that's like understandable for an allopathic lens. And there's also the people that are like want to move really far away from that and say, no, we have our own systems and I don't want anything to do with that. But then I think there are a lot of people who are somewhere in between where they can see the utility of both. I mean, the reality is like all the systems can actually be useful. It's just how are they actually
Absolutely.
working together? And what I'm hearing from you is maybe where there's room for action for people is how to, whether you're a teacher, a practitioner, a yoga therapist, are you connected with your teachers? Are you getting the right kind of support where you're deepening not only your own practice, but also your understanding of these systems and letting that be part of like the foundation in which like you're teaching from, or you're practicing from. And if that foundation gets stronger, our whatever comes after is like just an extension of that.
Yes.
And on that note, let's talk about maybe some of these models that we're mentioning, some of these systems. How does that sound?
Before you go there, I want to just say one thing, because what I have heard is that a kind of acupuncture has now been subsumed under physical therapy under the term of dry needling.
Right.
And this is really the kind of thing that is at danger for yoga, that our breathing techniques or methodologies of meditation, etc., will be borrowed, taken over, subsumed under, say, psychological models or physical therapy models. And, one of the things that happens with a good acupuncturist is that they develop a relationship with chi. When they are needling someone, they are a conduit for chi. And when the needle goes in, they have a felt sense in their fingers, whether or not it's a well-placed needle and whether or not this particular nodule has uh, the strength of what's happening in that particular place. And that within the models of traditional Chinese medicine about how qi flows in the body gives them something. It communicates something about the human system. So if dry needling lacks those things, lacks that development with prana, lacks the understanding of how the individual nodules on a meridian are connected, etc., something is truly lost. And some benefits may come out of dry needling, but wouldn't it be so much better if you had an acupuncturist who was handling that part, right?
Yeah.
What I fear happening in yoga and yoga therapy is that yoga is primarily a means of transforming the human system. And the transformation is not only physical, I will say, not primarily physical. The transformation is a shift in our perspective, the way that we orient in the world, especially around identity. And with that transformation, there comes an awareness of presence beyond the physical body, beyond simply mental thoughts. So it's fine to think about our techniques in a therapeutic application. I'm a little bit agnostic about people taking over techniques and incorporating them into their physical therapy practices and whatnot, because of course we always want people to get better. And if it can help them, great. And the part that I'm very aware of and that I'm nervous about is that yoga is not simply a physical practice.
Right.
Healing is not just repair of the tissues. And it's this greater function, this really truly special part of how yoga allows the uncovering of something which is truly magical and the birthright of every being that's alive, and allows that to bloom and flourish in the person in their life. That is the most important thing to me in yoga. And our therapeutic technologies, if they're just taken over or ripped out of the context, then I fear that this part of the journey and of the potential life transformation for someone is lost. And
Right.
that is where this is integrative medicine actually possible or not. I tend to fall on the side of no, it's integrative medicine is not possible. We cannot create a single model for thinking out about how the human system functions. But complementary medical
Right.
systems can really, I think, be immensely helpful. And it's so nice to share a student or a client with who's also going to someone who has a lot of skill in their area of expertise. And that's such a joy, even if I have no contact with that teacher or that doctor.
Super, super helpful. This, especially, this piece around I'm hearing you say is like, it's, the healing. I love that what you said, like healing's not just a repair of the tissues. It's really about this like uncovering within the person. And I mean, in the sutras, like it's really simply put, and maybe simple isn't the right word, but it's, share in the beginning of the sutras and you say this a lot, the results of practicing yoga are clarity or discernment, and you're more established in who you really are. And in this model, who you really are is actually spirit. All the other stuff is really important, and we need it to take care of our container, but that's because our spirit actually sees through our physical body. So if there's some imbalances and stuff, that we just have to work on that, because that impacts how we perceive. When you were saying, that, it's not just a repair of the tissues, I think there's maybe some, what we're really talking about here is like, how do we ensure that the yogic path isn't like short circuited?
That's
Maybe
right.
that's not the right
That's
word.
exactly right. No, it's exactly
Like,
correct.
yeah,
It's exactly correct. Because if you
some
rip out of the techniques out of their context, they've lost their context, and then they go to this other system that doesn't have the magic. It doesn't, I mean,
exactly.
it's not that it doesn't have magic, it doesn't, but its purposes are not at all what our yogic purposes are. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, why would I go to the yogi? I can just get this over here. I just get these breathing and stuff over here. And it's like, because the whole purpose of the techniques is not the techniques. It's not the surface healing. It's like this deep transformation.
Yeah. that surface, and also even on the surface, like that could be an entry point for someone. That could be the first step. But I hear what you're saying, that
Exactly.
there's like, let's throw out some examples. Without, I like what you said earlier. You're like, let's not talk too much about what we think, why we think people are doing what they're doing. Let's just talk about what they are. And a few examples that I see a lot, because I work with grown-ups, but I also work with lots of kids and teenagers in schools. And so a big example would be box breathing. Right? This is like almost like it's pretty mainstream enough that even if you're not in, taking a yoga class or practicing yoga or something, you've probably heard of something like this because it's pretty common in therapy and in schools. And box breathing is one iteration of Samavriti Pranayama, right?
Yeah.
Because for those who are not familiar with box breathing, it's like you're tracing kind of a square with your breath. So say you're doing inhale 4, and then you go across the square, you hold 4, you go down, you exhale 4, and then you hold after exhale for 4, or you can replace that with whatever number. The idea is that, you're doing something on the same thing on every part of the breath, and you're holding, there's some retention there. So this is an example that I see a lot pretty regularly in sessions, like especially with newer clients. They're like, "Hey, can we try putting box breathing in the practice?" And I find that so interesting because I'm always like, "Oh, where did you learn about that technique? Like why did that person recommend it to you?" And this wonderful client actually shared with me the other day. They said, my therapist was just like throwing out some strategies. So I'm just wondering, can this be in the practice? Now, this particular client I've worked with for 9 years, they know a little bit about breathing, but they just started to go into therapy, and they were dealing with a lot of anxiety. And I think it's coming from a place of, since my therapist is offering this, like, this will probably work for me. We're not saying that that's not true. And um, I had the conversation very nicely with the client at that time, that I said, okay, and let's talk about what we are actually doing in your yoga therapy practice. And maybe it would be useful to actually talk about what your experience has been and how you feel after. And then if you have more questions, we can talk a little bit about why the tools are there. And I wouldn't usually do that super often with clients to like break it down like that, but it was actually so useful for them because they were like, "Oh, I don't really know what the purpose of box breathing is." And then when I mentioned to them, well, this is how this tool is different than extending the exhale, which is something that we're working on. And when we're holding after the inhale and exhale, for some people, this is why we do it, or this is what it's for. The reason I'm bringing that up is because in yoga therapy, we know that holding after the breath is, one, not appropriate for every single person, not always appropriate as the first thing that they do, especially if they're a newer practitioner, and that oftentimes preparation is needed for most people. So if the first thing you're doing is box breathing and you're saying, okay, I'm going to inhale for 8, hold for 8, et cetera, you're taking these really big jumps with the breath that will have an influence on your system, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be a positive one. And then when people are giving this techniques, are they also educating people on that and also understanding, like, well, if there's not the right preparation, these could be some of the side effects. What do we do in those scenarios? How do we pacify then how the person's system's being activated? So, I mean, obviously I have a lot to say on box breathing, but I actually think it's such a great example because it's so commonly spoken about. And especially in schools where teachers have very limited amount of time. So they're encouraged to learn like a few different techniques for their students during these brain breaks or mindful transitions. This is, I think, an example of how we're using these practices that need some preparation, maybe need a way to like come down from the practice, but how do we encourage these space holders in a way, because teachers are space holders, to encourage them to bring in these practices while also making sure we stay intact with what their function really is. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or is there maybe another technique that's coming to mind that's maybe really common?
I think that this is really a salient example. The one that's coming to my mind is Andrew Wiles used to hand out these cards. Maybe he still does, but I haven't seen one in a while. And it has on there a ratio: inhale 4, hold 7, exhale 8. And the instructions on the card were, I was just looking, I used to carry one of those cards with me just because I used it as an example so often.
I remember you told us about this one in our 300-hour, like 10 years back.
Yeah.
And we were like,
Yeah.
hold after the inhale for 7. Oh my God. And you're like,
Yeah. So
let's talk about
it's
this.
a therapeutic, Dr. Wiles is trying to help people, right? He has wonderful sincerity, and he's providing a ratio, and the card had on it written, do this for 3 breaths or maybe 4 breaths, not more, and it was very explicit. Don't do this for more than 3 or 4 breaths. And, the reason for that is because the ratio, which if we look at it, it's really a 1-to-2-0 ratio, right? Where there 4 is 1, and then hold after inhale 7. That's essentially 8. Call that, 2. It's 2, 4. It's 2 times 4 is 8. And then exhale is 8, right? So 1-to-2-0 ratio. And from the yoga perspective of things, inhale and hold after inhale are dangerous. And it doesn't mean that they're not very, very helpful. They are. And yet we should work on someone's breath and get them to be extending their breath before we are working on holds. Increase the pressure in the system. They're basically an advanced technique, and we want to make sure that the person has the capacity to do techniques that are that strong before they start doing them. So did it help people? Well, those cards are very popular, and I know that they get handed out a lot, etc. And I've been told time and time again that well, I did that, and it was pretty helpful for me, etc. Okay, I have no problem with that. I'm glad that it's helpful for them. The piece that is disappointing for me is that it ends there. And what happens with yoga is a transformative path. And we used to joke that, well, in real yoga, for a short while, if you're feeling better and you're feeling like lighter, and your life is getting more manageable, etc., and then you start to become aware of the way that your participation is the cause of many of the things that are really causing your suffering. And at that point, people start to plateau and even swing down because they're really doing real work. They're really coming into contact with, how am I structuring my environments and my circumstances and my life in a way that causes me suffering, and what can I do about that? And without proper support, it's very easy to conclude this yoga is not working.
Right.
I am no longer getting benefit from this because I'm not feeling better. Well, the whole point here is that if you want to feel better, you have to transform the way that you're operating in your life. And if you want to transform that, you have to become aware of what it is that's happening and how you're doing that. And if you want to become aware of that, we need to adjust the state of your system so that you have more stability and you have more awareness. And when you start seeing the ways that you're causing yourself suffering, that you have the capacity to handle that. If we just give somebody a single breathing technique and they do it for a little while, and then it helps and helps, and then there's no further developments, we're missing this huge opportunity for the person. One of our colleagues is in Southern California. She is fairly adamant that the more suffering, the better. Because the more suffering, the more motivation to really find out what's happening. And I'm not sure I agree wholeheartedly with that, but the point is that there's a recognition that we can't just think about these techniques as they're going to change me and I'm going to feel a little bit better, and then my problems are going to go away and I'm going to be able to keep doing all the things that I'm doing that are causing me problems, not have the problems of them.
Right. The motivation is what you're saying. The motivation needs to be different.
Yeah. And
Right.
if we're giving somebody a box breathing, okay, great. They feel better. Super. Wonderful. And there's the development from there that's possible. Right.
Yeah. And
So,
potentially, and that also might potentially be pushing them much further than their capacity really is in the moment.
yes. And if you do that, then for some percentage of the people, it will do not only not help, but it can really actively harm. Breathing techniques can trigger panic attacks, and breathing techniques can activate immense levels of anxiety and isolation and whatnot. So we shouldn't be thinking about this like, well, breathing techniques are good. No, again, this is a yoga teaching, but yoga is a science of experiences, and techniques are intentionally engineered experiences. So we need to understand what is the context that the experience is coming into, i.e., what is the person's state, what is their history, who are their relationship with, etc. Because as we have this understanding that we're administering an experience, then we can become more sensitive to the fact that you wouldn't administer all experiences to everybody. Actually, the skill of a yoga practitioner is having a sense and a knowing about what experience is going to be useful for the person that's in front of me.
Right. Absolutely. And you see this from my lens. I see this so much time, like so much in like the breathwork industry, that's gotten really popular. And I mean, sometimes people get annoyed with this, but I am such a stickler of like calling it pranayama and not breathwork. And I know that many people use those terms interchangeably, but for me, it's like an intentional choice, because when we say pranayama, like the meaning is in the meaning of what we're doing is in the word. Working with the influencing the movement of prana in your life force. That's really what's happening. When we say breath work, well, I'll just say when the word breath work is used, then it's like another way of taking out this element of our life force, and
That's
that
right.
is really the bridge to our consciousness and our spirit.
That's right.
But maybe more on that on a different time.
No, this is
I do
exactly correct. And no, it's exactly correct. And it collapses the three-dimensionality of yoga into this two-dimensional thing. And then what's lost is really our soul. What's really lost is the essence of who we are.
And there's this there's this temptation to take, say, like in these breathwork practices that have gotten really popular, of like it's very tempting to make them for mass consumption, right? Teaching as many people as possible, one size fits all, almost in a way where, and I know this isn't just true for breathwork, but other ways that yoga has been adapted or taken out of context, also in the way where it's quite like scripted and choreographed, right? So it doesn't leave a lot of room for a person to develop which we're both saying in yoga is really important, like a sense of agency around what's happening inside their system. So if things are scripted and choreographed, like we see this in many studios with like asana and teacher trainings, where you have the script, you have to follow the script. And sure, maybe in the beginning when someone's learning how to teach, it's very helpful to get some confidence, understand how things link together. But it's just like what you're saying, when you have this, you're teaching just one technique without the preparation or the proper delinking or coming down from it, you're taking this really sacred, important thing, ripping it out of its bigger picture. And you not only miss so much, there's a potential for a lot of harm. Because, with the breath work, for example, things are moving at the pace of what the teacher is saying, then the student's not really learning, like, well, what is my actual rhythm with my breathing? And maybe I can't hold for 8 seconds after that exhale. But if you teach, like in our yoga therapy lens or Viniyoga, if you teach it as a progression, which is how it's supposed to be taught, at least as a person's developing a relationship with their breath, then there's so much more room for autonomy there for the person to say, okay, well, we started with a 2-second hold. Now we're doing a 4, 6, 8. Okay, we're at an 8. I don't think I can do that. But guess what? I've already experienced some of these other steps and I can make my way back. And everyone's getting the same quote unquote instruction, but they're getting this like spectrum of possibility. And I think that I can't stress enough just how important that is, and how that really is, you can see it in real time getting lost, because I feel, and at least there's a desire to reach more and more people or to capitalize on these practices. But what are we losing in that whole process?
Well, I want to say quickly, my experience of having seen this in upfront and close with people is that they go to a quote breath work workshop, and then they do something which is very aggressive,
Right.
which facilitates a state change and a release. And then the instructor parades, for lack of a better word, around about how effective and magic the techniques have been. And what I will say is, I don't see any difference between that and getting high. You go and ingest a substance, it changes your state. There's insights, etc., that happen as a result of the change of state. And then you come back to your regular self and There's no support. Transformation requires the development of new patterning, and that happens through practice. That's why we call it practice. What do? You give yourself some experiences, and those experiences change your state, and you slowly learn to operate in this new state from the old state. And as you're learning that, you are seeing the ways that, oh, wow, I can't believe I've been so short with people, or oh, I can't believe that I just rush here or there, or whatever it may be, right? I don't even give time for, fill in the blank. And transformation that is fast and furious, I won't say it doesn't work. It does work, but it lacks something. Yoga is a path. Yoga it's something that we walk and that we do, and that over time has immense impact on our system and how we operate in the world and who we are, etc. And it's not that you can't take these techniques out of our path and inflict them on people and get results. You can, but that's missing what yoga is about.
Right. Yeah, it's so helpful to hear. It's just so helpful to hear your reflections on that, because what I love about your approach in general as a teacher, but also in the way you're sharing this, is that you're not getting caught up in, I feel like anyway, you're not getting caught up in the why, or like why somebody's maybe approaching it that way, or how they might feel about it, or even like, getting caught up in like the technical aspects of like, you have to do the technique like this, and this is how it's supposed to be taught. What you're really talking about is, if we want to zoom out, like, what is the path here? The path is toward understanding ourselves more, being discerning, being engaged in the world. And if that's the path, then we need to ensure that the practices are staying in integrity with this direction.
That's right.
And of course, people will be in different part. Everyone's in a different part of that process. For some people, their practice is more about, for example, managing pain, or managing an autoimmune condition and their day-to-day symptoms, and the practice are going to be very supportive of that. And like you were saying, when you're working with the teacher or you're getting that guidance, you can get that support. And if you're working with the right person, they're also hopefully giving you some things that's also moving you in a direction. So it can totally be a both and. It's not just, I don't think either of us are saying that if you're, doing this work that, everything has to be, meditation right away, a really intense pranayama practice right away. The idea is that there's a sense of direction here, and each person's direction is super unique. So of course we could still have group classes and people can try out different experiences, but even in those settings, we also have to be mindful of, can we also still create this pattern, or help people create a pattern where they are getting a sense of familiarity with their own systems, even in a group setting. And on that note, one model I wanted to throw out there that we use a lot, that we haven't quite mentioned yet, is our Panchamaya model. When we're thinking about our own medical systems, or our own frameworks and how we perceive the body. And you said in the very beginning of our time together how, when we're in allopathic medicine, or you're in a physician's office, like the way that they're seeing the body is just, it's not necessarily, it might be incomplete from a yoga perspective, but it's correct in its own right. But ours is also valid in its own right. And I see the Panchamaya model as, say, you've taught it to us a lot, had really ingrained in a really, really deep and nuanced way on how to utilize it one-on-one with people, but really how to also embody it in how we just experience our own humanity. I think this model, I'm hesitant to say, like, I think everyone should be using it, because I think it also requires a lot of study and a lot of training. I'm not here to say that all psychotherapists out there should be using a Panchamaya model, or that every kind of practitioner should. What I'm really saying is that there's room for this model to exist in yoga and yoga therapy, and it kind of has to, because it's what also distinguishes us from other kinds of providers. Not necessarily better or worse, but just like, again, parallel, right? It can just be a different kind of framework. And in this model, what I think it encourages people to do is to not only live in one kind of identity and one kind of experience that they're having. So I guess a different way of saying it is, if you are having, persistent pain, that might be living maybe more on the Annamaya or the Pranamaya on a physical sense, in like that like tangible experience that you feel. And if we're only identifying with that one way of experiencing the pain, then we're also missing all this other possibility of how the pain influences your identity, how it influences your relationships, your perception of yourself, your place in the world, your dharma, et cetera, et cetera. And also there's all these other dimensions like anandamaya and emotions of how pain actually influences emotions that you experience, or maybe it can even be the other way around, that there's been emotions that are, living in the system that are maybe actually influencing the pain. So I know it's not linear, but I wanted to just mention that to see, just what are your thoughts on that? Because I know that you use this model quite a lot.
So what I want to say is that Panchamaya, just for those who don't know, or originating out of the Taittiriya Upanishad, specifically the Brahmanandavali, which is the second section of it, as an in-depth description. Pancha means 5, Maya means the all-encompassing. So it's 5 lay of our human system. Now, it has been called the kosha model, and that's the main way that it's mostly referred to in the West these days, which is unfortunate because the word kosha is not in the system, is not in the original text. It comes from a commentary on the Taittiriya Upanishad. And the way that Panchamaya is essentially yoga's version of holistic. It says we have 5 aspects of human system, like body, physiology, mind, behavior, personality, and emotions. These are the physical sections. So, of course, there's also spirit, but that's not material. So it's not part of the 5 mayas. It's not part of the Panchamaya. And you hear a lot of people saying things like body, mind, and spirit, or body, breath, and spirit, etc. These are fine models, but they're not yoga's model. Yoga's model of holistic is body, physicality, mind, personality, behavior, emotions. And what we say is that every aspect is interconnected with every other aspect. So if something changes on one level, then it will have ripple effects in the whole system. If you stub your toe, then that changes your breathing, changes your physiology, and that makes your mind do something. And the way that your personality is shifts, at least momentarily. And your emotions also change, like your mood can change, right? So for us as yogis, we are thinking about not just like pain and how that might affect someone's outlook on life or their emotions, etc., but we're holding the whole thing as a single unit, and we have tools that can address each of the different mayas as a way of influencing and changing the directionality of actually, this is reminding me, I think this is a little bit more Ayurveda, but the difference between Ayurveda and allopathic medicine, but it applies to yoga. So in Ayurveda, the starting point is the qualities, and then the actions, and then the dravya, the substance. So you get guna, karma, dravya. You get qualities, actions, then you have substance. So we can't say something like, there's all kinds of examples in Ayurveda of herbs that have different impacts on the system when they are prepared in a different way. Like if something is a liquid, what is the impact on the system versus if it's like a raw thing? Like the obvious one that a lot of people know is ginger. So a raw ginger can be inflammatory and cause you problems. Dried powdered ginger can heal inflammation, etc. With allopathic medicine, you start with substance. Then you get actions. And qualities are kind of not even discussed or very little. So what you get is quote unquote side effects. I hate that terminology. It's not a side effect. It's an effect. It's just not the main effect that you are taking the medicine for, so you call it a side effect, but it's no less an effect than the other things that you're taking. Whereas the focus in yoga is more about what is the quality that will be useful in your system, and specifically what quality where will have the most impact. And that quality is not just going to be in a single dimension, physicality or physiology. It is also going to be in mind and in personality and behavior and in emotions. And so we can actually support, instead of having these side effects and things, we can have techniques that deliver the same quality or similar quality, but on these other dimensions as well. And that is a level of sophistication and consideration of the human system as a holistic system or a holistic being or body or a holistic thing, which I think is not as much appreciated as it should be.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's just so powerful to think about how these different dimensions are, one, not linear, so not koshas or layers, but actually just interacting all the time. It's really beautiful. And, just I think what you're sharing really speaks to how these practices are really experiential. You can give a practice to, that maybe is addressing more specifically Anandamaya, which is the fifth Maya and the most subtle, the emotions. And that actually can have a ripple effect on some physical experiences a person is having, or the state of their mind or their digestion. And also they actually have to just try it. We don't necessarily know because it's also experiential. And I think it's so, in some ways, like the antithesis of how allopathic medicine, I should say, like the Western healthcare models, thinks about like what is valid and not valid, and what is evidence-based. And I'm definitely not here to, I think research can be very helpful and important. And like you were saying earlier, like, each person's experience is so different. It also can be very hard to quantify. How do you quantify prana? And you can give 40 people in a study the same pranayama practice that hopefully has this goal of, like, say, helping with sleep disturbances or something like that, like for an example. And if half of them have improved sleep and half of them have no change, then the study would maybe determine, like, okay, this is, there's no evidence to show that this technique is useful for sleep. So we're taking the pranayama practice and this Panchamaya or 5-dimension model and trying to apply it into, this theoretical study that's being evaluated from a Western science lens. It's really challenging because, as we think about yoga therapy and as an emerging field, and there's a call for more research so that it's more evidence-based, that more people use it. I think there can definitely be utility in that. But, what are we losing on the way? And is in this, theoretical study, I guess I'm saying, like, if you were to study it this way and that was the outcome, can we really say that that's true?
This is so important.
Yeah.
This is so important. Research is, in many instances, not all of them, but many instances, starting from the assumption that all the participants are the same, or that all of the participants have enough similarity that we're going to see if this substance works on the person. And from a yoga perspective, which is shared with Ayurveda, the point is that's a ludicrous place to start. You cannot start from that place because everybody is different. Like you may have the same ailment, but the cause for why you have it and the development of it are different, and where you are in the avastha, where you are in the timing of the progression of the disease is different. So you need different things. And I take umbrage at the idea that double blind is legitimizing. From what my own experience of yoga and what I see is that yoga is the relationship. The relationship is yoga. So you're going to cut that out and you're going to see if the techniques work. Okay, you've just made my 3-dimensional yoga 1-dimensional now. So there's something that is really essential that is lost when yoga is taken from the outside without understanding what it is that we're doing or what our full magic is. And it's like if an instrument came from another culture that we didn't know their music or didn't know how to play it and whatnot, we just thought, well, I know how to play music. What notes does this thing make? And then I can just play it. But how am I playing it? I'm playing it according to my own musical system.
I mean, this is colonization in a nutshell, in ways, right?
Yes, that's right.
We see this in India with British colonization. Like an example would be chai. And I mean, and in China as well, the exploitation of land and labor to grow tea, and then they moved to then they I mean I'm very much simplifying this, but they moved to India. And even the history showed how, like, tea, India is obviously very, very diverse, and there's many parts of India where tea is actually not a part of the culture, coffee is. But back then there would be systems created to get locals to actually have a dependence on tea, like by the British would have these in the factories, and with the labor workers, they have mandatory like tea breaks in the afternoon, and developing this structure in a day that wasn't necessarily true for every single culture in India, right? Okay, around this afternoon time, this is when we drink tea. And it's, taking so much beauty and diversity and layers of a culture kind of out of the picture and just imposing what you think it should be, for your own like economic or gain or whatever that is. I think when you're saying, we've been talking about, like, taking these practices out of context without the full picture being not just the appropriate preparation or what's happening for the person, but also these models, like how is prana moving, what's happening there, and the Panchamaya, these 5 dimensions, that there's things happening not just on the physical structure, but also like behavioral and emotional. And then there's other piece that you're mentioning, this other model, in a sense, I want to throw out there that you're saying is the relationship, and how it's actually such a huge, you mentioned it kind of quickly, but I want to go back to it because it is such a, if not one of the most important things, in some ways, the most important part of really what we do as yoga therapists is building that relationship and that container for you and the person that you're supporting. And I remember one time you said years ago in a class that we were talking about the importance of cultivating a relationship and trust is, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, this is years ago, but you had said, like, if you don't have the relationship, it doesn't really matter what practices you give. They can be helpful a little bit here and there, and they'll do some stuff, but you're not going to get very far because the practices are actually being transmitted through the relationship that you and the person have co-created, and how they're receiving it, those practices, and their perception of those practices has so much to do with the relationship that you two have cultivated. So I want to pause there, one, to see, like, is that resonating for like what you've shared in the past? And did I get that right?
Yeah, no, I think that it's fundamental. It's fundamental. Like, who we are as practitioners is it cannot be reduced down to some things that we do. We have to start with, we have to stay with the essence of yoga, which is this opening to something beyond our physicality that resides in us and through us. I would say spirit, but others may say God, or someone may say higher self, or the wording is, I don't think, as important. But what happens through yoga is, as you were saying earlier, the development of clarity and of discernment, etc. And more fundamentally, it's the development of authenticity and really self-expression. That, at least from the Indian model, is something that is modeled. And it's something that is, if not actually passed down from teacher to student, it is developed in the student through their interactions with the teacher and their contact with the teacher. And that means relationship is fundamental to what we do and how we do it. And I don't, that's one of the things that, like insurance in the Western medical model has eliminated relationship. People are just reports, and the doctor is given 6 minutes to read the report and give a solution. And it's like, time out. And so much of what we hold as primary is in yoga is that interpersonal connection and what happens as a result of that. So if another model or another system doesn't hold that as primary, it's very easy to miss in looking at another system. And that, to me, when we're talking about integration or complementary medicine or whatnot, I don't think we can probably trust others to see what's important to us in us unless we are advocating for it and unless we are really clear about what's important to us. So this is what we need to do. We need to be clear about what is essential for us with yoga, and then when we're in discussion with others, we need to hold it to that. And to do something like to set up institutions that don't honor that or that don't stay with that in yoga is to lose yoga, actually.
Right. I think these are really great, I think these are really great actionable things that I think people who are listening can start to get more curious about. And maybe you already are curious about this and you have some of the same challenges or questions that we're posing. I think these are some great directions forward. It's like get clear. What support do you need to get clear? Do you have the relationships already in your life, or do you need to cultivate them with teachers or peers and stuff who have some shared values where with your teachers to receive the practices that are appropriate for you right now, to get some clarity in how you're moving forward, and whether it's in how you're practicing or how you're passing down these practices. Another thing to be curious about is having a better understanding of what your response is on these 5 different dimensions when you're being met with having to take these practices out of context, or try to take yoga but fit it into a model that doesn't actually include like what is fundamental to yoga. But what happens for you, whether that is anger or confusion, or maybe the need to please, or the need to get that job, or whatever it might be. And it's not that there's any judgment on what the response is, but I think that's also a missing piece for people. I know it has been for me, that in the past there's been, what's been really driving is like a need for acceptance, and a need for belonging, and a need to be seen as legitimate. And that often drove many decisions I would make around how I moved my yoga forward, where I would teach, who I would collaborate with. And as I've gotten support through my own practice and teachers over time, my values have also gotten clearer. But then not only my values, but then the actions that actually come from them. So I just want to encourage like whoever is listening that depending on where you're at, I think that's also a useful tool to throw into the toolbox as you move forward.
I think it's a fantastic place to conclude.
So my website is findyourbreath.net. That's where you can find out how to schedule a free 15-minute call with me if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, whether in a mentorship capacity or yoga therapy capacity. On my website too, there's information on my online platform, which you can access from anywhere in the world. And that's a great place to get some exposure to a few group classes a week that we focus on some of the more subtle practices that are often not as represented in Western yoga, like we do chanting classes and pranayama and things like that. And then there's an extensive on-demand platform to practice alongside. So findyourbreath.net is a great place to start.
Super. Lovely conversation with you today. Thank you so much for all the work that you are doing and for being so active, and both in the way you're reflecting on and the actions you're taking in the yoga world. It really gives me great hope for yoga when I see people like you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Chase, for being here and for everything you offered to us today, and that you continue to through your teachings.